Hello, everybody. I am Summer Vanderbilt, the Recruitment Development Manager here at Higher Level. Thank you for joining us this morning for our High Notes webinar program today with Acclaim HR Consulting, one of our HR consulting connections in Raleigh, North Carolina, to bring us insights on the do's and don'ts of employee documentation and best practices to avoid common mistakes and to stay in compliance. Now, a few things before we get started. This call will last less than an hour. You are set up in listen-only mode, but there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. There's also the chat. If you would like to drop questions into that chat throughout the presentation, we will not answer them right away, but we will pull some of those questions at the end to go over. So we will open up the mics. Panelists will be able to address those questions directly. A little bit about our panelists today. We are joined by Gary and David Roscoe. They founded the HR Consulting in 2009, immediately set out to help clients in the Raleigh-Durham area survive the Great Recession. So many small and mid-sized businesses were bleeding out amidst the terrible economy and sometimes needlessly succumbing due to expensive and solvable HR problems. Gary's extensive HR experience, legal education, breadth of industry exposure, which includes manufacturing, distribution, telecommunications, energy, and the Department of Defense, ensured his readiness for the difficult task at hand. HR Consulting successfully diagnosed client problems, implemented affordable solutions, and helped struggling businesses not only stay afloat and later thrive as the economic storm subside. Now partnered with his son, David, an Army combat veteran and Commandant's List graduate of the U.S. Army War College, HR Consulting is prepared to help a new generation of clients, particularly veteran-owned businesses, implement comprehensive strategies to achieve their goals and fortify their gains as new economic storms loom ahead. All right, guys, I will let you take it from here.
All right, very good. Thanks, Summer. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us and spending your hour with us. One thing that I think you should know about our company is, number one, I've been doing HR my entire career, which is now over 40 years. And Acclaim HR Consulting was founded in 2009. Although it was founded in the Raleigh metro area of North Carolina, the spread of our business now is much wider. We have clients in New York, Northern Virginia, both Carolinas, Georgia, Florida, Alabama. I'm probably missing one, Dave, but that gives you the picture. Our whole purpose is to recognize the fact that you and your business are in business to do one thing, and that's make money. And the biggest hole in most companies' pockets, especially small, middle-sized companies, is their people management skills. They can be very costly, they can waste a lot of time, they can cause a lot of anguish, and in settlements, lawsuits, etc., can really harm the bottom line. We want to help prevent that, and that's the whole reason for our being. Our conversation today is going to be on a very key element that a lot of managers either don't realize is important or kind of slough off. You know, it's not what I want to do. I want to run the machines out there. No, documentation is critically important. And when I turn it over to Dave in a minute, it's going to be his job to primarily talk to you about those key elements and why it is so critically important. But trust me when I tell you, if I had to give you a ratio, if you have your documentation in a row and your ex-employee decides to sue or go to some government agency, the odds of you being successful are about 95-5. On the other hand, if you have no or very poor documentation, I can almost reverse those numbers and say that the claimant is going to be successful about 95% of the time. You need to level that playing field and even up those odds. Documentation is a very vital way to do that. So for the next 45 minutes or so, Dave, it's all yours.
All right, let's talk about it. Documentation is a very, very important foundational pillar to the threats that Gary talked about in terms of holding them off, mitigating them. Well, one of the things we wanted to do today was address some of the reasons that managers, supervisors, companies in general don't do documentation. There's a lot of misconceptions, and frankly, they're pretty easily broken under a little bit of scrutiny. So we're going to do that today, and by the end of this, what we're hoping for is that you're going to walk away with a warmer embrace of documentation, how it can be done quicker, simpler, and more effectively. Let's get into that. All right, so here's our agenda. I'm going to go pretty quickly through the first half of this agenda because I want to get us down to the exemplars, the things not to do, and offer us an opportunity to have some Q&A at the end. So, scope. Let's talk about this. We'll cover what's going to be covered, obviously, so you don't need to pay too much attention to that. What I really want to draw your eye to, though, is what this presentation doesn't cover. What we're not going to do is talk about how you design a performance review plan or process, how to conduct some of the meetings that would involve this type of documentation, or any sort of lessons on hiring, firing, promoting. These are actions that would come from documentation, but what we're really going to cover today is the documentation itself. So let's talk about what is documentation. What are we talking about when we say that term? It is basically setting the expectations of an employee. What do they need to do? What would be above performance levels that were expected? What is below performance? This provides the employee an azimuth to know whether they are on track, exceeding expectations, or falling behind, and what things can be done to remedy that. It's important also to understand from a company's perspective, this is the organization, the company's memory, all right? Managers and supervisors are going to move on, they're going to promote out, they're going to go to different companies, especially in the labor market right now where we see a lot of individuals moving on from companies every 2-3 years. This is very important for you to have that continuity. Documentation won't leave, it won't promote, it won't find another job. It's going to stay with you. It is your company or organization's memory. So it's very important to invest the time in order to have solid documentation so you have that memory, and that memory being useful in terms of giving you options in case a problem arises. It's also, I want you to pay attention to that quote below. Some of you may recognize that from a movie that came out in the 90s, Training Day. It's a great quote, and it really encapsulates the importance of documentation. It's not what you know, it's what you can prove. If you go up against an employee and you have two different stories, your ability to say, I have this documented, is going to be the difference between the employee story being believed or yours. I would say it is fair to say that in employment law, in criminal law, a person is innocent until proven guilty. In employment law, the company is guilty until proven innocent. It's important to keep that in mind. So why do we not see this more? I will tell you right now, we kind of are like EMTs in the business world. We are only called in when problems arise, usually. And when we're called in, it's usually a point where the problem has now become a crisis. One of the first questions we ask when there's a problem is there documentation? And you'd be shocked at the number of times we get the answer, no, none, or inadequate documentation. So why is this happening? Why is this relatively simple task not being done? Well, those are the three top excuses there: too much time, too difficult, it can always be done later. These are the reasons why it's not getting done typically in our experience. But like I said, what we're going to show you is why those three things are not true and give you a roadmap on how to do it more effectively in the future. So what are those types of documentation? These are things, I'd say the top bullet there is probably the most important. You are capturing strong rapport performance, good or bad behavior. This is your ability to say that this event happened on this date and it had this impact to the company, either to its benefit or detriment. That's very, very important. But we often get caught in a trap where we think documentation has to be like this book report. It has to be very formal. It has to be legalese language, and it is very, very time consuming and difficult to do right. Not true at all. Documentation can be notes that are taken during a meeting. It can be an email you write to yourself, capturing an event that occurred for later use in a performance review or something like that. It can be the type of warnings that you gave verbally that you're now just capturing in writing, so that you can say that did happen, and who potentially witnessed it. These are all kinds of documentation. Don't get locked into the thinking that documentation always has to be this very legalistic report. All right, it can be simple and informal as long as it has the right elements. And we'll talk about some of those things in the presentation. So what should you document? What are we documenting exactly? As we covered, it's important to capture the strong report performance, the good or bad behavior, any discussion about performance. If you engage an employee about their performance, take notes during that. Document the documentation that you and how the employee responds to it. That's a key thing that a lot of people overlook too. But there's a key word at the beginning of those first 3 bullets I want you to pay attention to. Shortly after, okay? I think we encounter a lot of times where documentation is done retroactively after a problem arises. This is a big mistake. You are already biasing what you're going to write. You are writing it for a purpose at that point instead of just capturing an objective event objectively. You don't want to do this. So it's important to always capture these kinds of things, capture this documentation shortly after any of those top 3 bullets occur. You can say that I did this because it was a reaction to an observation, an event, as opposed to somebody filed a complaint against me and now I got to get my ducks in a row because I didn't do so already. This is actually a very common mistake we see with companies, and it's one that we really strongly dissuade you away from. Obviously, the examples that you see below are kind of real world examples of when you would do that, but those are pretty common. It's just I really want to emphasize the shortly after part. That's key, and it's something you need to remember. Documentation procedure. So let's take this example to give you an idea of how easy, small, clear, concise, impactful documentation can benefit you. Let's take the example of something most people dread, the annual review, writing up the performance appraisal. So the procedure goes like this. You've seen this cycle before. You have a plan, you go clockwise. You document the expectations, you give those to the employee. About halfway through the year, you say you are either above, at, below our expectations for you. Then you have the review. You talk about how did it all end up at the end. Were there any corrective measures that were given that weren't followed? Did the performance continue to exceed? Are you now looking to maybe promote this person? You know, you cover that in the annual review. And then obviously you have your actions and results, which will be the manifestation of what that annual review meant. But here, I want to show you it from the perspective of documentation. So we have all of the portions of the documentation performance annual appraisal cycle laid out here in a linear timeline. Those blue circles is where I want you to pay attention. If you capture those on a regular basis, small, concise observations of employee behavior and performance, gather those together over the course of the year, and then have them ready for your annual review. The annual review writes itself. Instead of writing it and cramming it all into a short period of time and doing so for all your employees, which will likely mean that the quality of the annual review you write is not going to be as high as it could be. And that communicates something to your employees. It shows you don't care. It shows that their performance isn't meaningful in your eyes. If instead you are able to capture those observations over the course of the year, little by little, and then amalgamate them into the review at the end, you're going to be better prepared. You're going to have their performance better documented, and it's going to show them that you care. And that really can go a long way in making them care and making them perform above the standards you lay out. So this is what it basically looks like over the course of the year, over the course of the months that you have during this annual review period. You're capturing all these little blue circles, these documented observations. Little trick I used to do when I was a federal supervisor. All of my employees, I gave a very respectful code name, all right? And it was something unusual. It was something that would stand out. I'll explain why. Every time they did something, good, bad, any sort of performance observation I had about them, I wrote myself an email capturing the who, what, when, where, why, who else observed it in a short little email. It took me 2 minutes each time I did it, a few sentences. I would then put that code name in the subject line of that employee, and I would send it to myself. And that way, I had at the end of the year a bunch of emails I sent about that employee. The code name, obviously, you can use the employee's name, but there's things you're talking about other than performance about that employee. The code name distinguished those emails as things pertaining to performance. Pulled all those up, and I was able to have all the ammunition I needed to write a really good annual review right at my fingertips. It made it so much easier. It was such a simple thing, and you are capturing it using the official documentation system of your company, your email system. You have it there. It's got a timestamp on it. It's a really great mechanism to just capture little observations like that. It makes review time so much easier at the end of the year. So do this throughout the months. Little work over a long period of time makes that annual review so much more simple. Okay, what happens if you don't do this? All right, so we got to remember documentation, another kind of misconception we want to break you from. Documentation is often thought of in terms of the employee that's doing bad things or demonstrating bad behavior. You got to dispel that in your mind, because this is also the mechanism you use to capture effective, good employees. And you'd say to yourself, well, if I already know that, why do I have to document it? Why should I have to go through the extra time and effort to document these things if I know I want to promote them? What you're doing in this case is preventing another employee from saying, you promoted that person because of your personal bias. The more effective documentation you have to say this employee performed above and beyond on this occasion, this occasion, and this occasion, will be able to neutralize any arguments you get from another employee who feels they should have been promoted before the person you are promoting. It's very important to do this, and it's important to do it for the good, effective employees, as well as the ones that are falling behind or demonstrating bad behavior. So some of the feedback there in that statistic is important because it's something that we hear a lot from employees. One of the things that they yearn for, the ones who care, is good feedback, quality feedback. Even ones that say how they can perform better are things that are consistently requested by employees. So it's important to remember that it's not just about the bad things happening and the bad circumstances, but the good ones as well, so that you were able to say fairly, here is why I took the actions that I did. Obviously, the ineffective, toxic employees, very, very important. I don't think I have to stress that point too much, but understand that this is something that is neglected more often than it should, and these are the consequences. If you don't do this, it can result in litigation. It can result in a government agency complaint. And if you think the time you spend doing documentation is bad, wait until you deal with one of those problems. I can tell you it will make the small investment of documentation look like nothing. And what we want to do is, whenever possible, encourage businesses out there, business owners, HR, whoever is out there, please don't make this mistake. Wear the seatbelt, do your documentation. It will save you in the end.
Dave, let me add one thing to that.
Sure.
It is axiomatic, and I'm going to say the axiom now. Most employees want to do a good job for their manager if their manager will tell them what a good job is. I have had managers in my lifetime, and I've heard many other people say the same thing. Will have their manager tell them, if you never hear from me, you know you're doing a good job. No. If I don't hear from you, I don't know I'm doing a good job. I guess I'm doing a good job. But either good or bad, people want to hear from you. Reassure the ones who are doing it right, correct the ones who are doing it wrong. Most of them want to do a good job for you. So tell them what a good job is. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great point. And I've heard that myself too, both in my own professional experience as well as talking to clients as well. No news is not good news. No news is neglect. Communicate the good behavior, communicate the performance that is solid and above board. Those employees want to know that. So we've talked a lot about the theory as the why, the consequences. Let's start looking at what right looks like. What does good, clear, concise, impactful documentation look like? Here's an example for you of informal documentation. This could be kind of like the email example that I talked about before. What would you send yourself? And I will tell you that most of these are actual real world examples that we've dealt with, obviously with the names changed, but these are the types of scenarios that we've dealt with. And frankly, some of these, I think actually none of these were actually documented effectively when they occurred, which really put the company at risk. So we take this situation here, an offensive comment was made. If you want to document this, please look at the elements. Read it over and see the elements that are in there. These are the ingredients that you want in good informal documentation. All right. Will I give you a second to look at that? And I'll draw your eye to the very end of this slide. The last sentence, last words in the last sentence. Avoid editorializing. Even when you have behavior that you find repulsive or distasteful, it is important to remain as scientific as possible when you are doing documentation. Don't let your emotions bleed into the documentation because it reduces your credibility, it creates the perception of bias, and worse, it can create a liability later when you have a situation like this, where the employee did something wrong. It can undermine your ability to deal with that employee in a proper fashion. So let's look at some of these key ingredients. What do you have here? You have the date, you have the time, you have the location. These are important ingredients that every bit of documentation, informal or formal, should have. These are oftentimes neglected. Don't do it. It's very simple. You can see this whole thing is just a few sentences, but these key ingredients must be met. What else do we have? Well, we have who. We have the people identified within the situation and the situation itself. What makes this situation impactful, noteworthy? What in a situation of bad behavior, what makes it bad? Without saying it in colorful or editorializing terms, just be scientific. This gives you the necessary context of what we're talking about. Again, going into the situation, and notice here, witnesses. Who else was nearby when this happened? Who else observed this behavior? Who else, if you need them, can step up and say, I will write a witness statement, or I will add to your documentation, or I will testify if need be. But this happened the way this documentation captured it. These are all very, very important ingredients. And then finally, a reaction and official response. So what did you do about the situation? What actions did you take to remedy it or deal with it? And what was their reaction to it? In this kind of situation, you may not necessarily have an action at the end of the day. It may be determined that that may not be what you want to have as the result. But having done this, you put this in your file, you have it on hand, and if it happens again, what you're not dealing with is a situation where you're trying to prove a pattern. You can do it readily, and then you can take more actions. Documentation gives you options. That's probably one of the most important statements of this entire presentation. Documentation gives you options. What are some common mistakes we see? What are the things that happen a lot that we would really advise people not to do? Record actions, record statements. Don't describe individuals. Again, don't editorialize and don't try to play psychologist. It's not your job. Your job is to record what happened so that the company can make an informed decision. Say only what is necessary and factual. Superfluous writing, a lot of adjectives, a lot of colorful language and descriptions, it's not necessary. One, it's a waste of time because it's going to make your documentation longer and eat more of your time that you're putting into it. But two, the more you write actually creates more liability in terms of your documentation. The more words that an opposing attorney can look at and scrutinize gives the defense more ammunition when you are trying to justify, say, a firing or a demotion or something like that. Keep it strictly focused on capturing the situation at hand. Cite your employee handbook. If you have a rule, cite that rule. Say page something, page whatever, explicitly states that we do not allow this behavior. Your documentation should marry up very well with your company's policy as captured in your employee handbook. And always make sure that you have an employee signed handbook acknowledgement form, because that really is crucial to ensure that the employee said, I have reviewed your policy, I agree with it, and I will abide by That's another common mistake we see, and it actually undermines even good documentation when you're trying to deal with a problem amongst employees and bad behavior or poor performance. Don't procrastinate, don't backdate. Remember that term, shortly after. So don't wait on this stuff. Get it done quickly. The more time that passes, the more question it raises as to why you're doing it then as opposed to early. This can create a whole new set of problems that you don't want to deal with. So make sure that it is done promptly. And remember that even at your word, that last bullet is very important too. Defense attorneys can't subpoena hard drives and check file creation dates. What you don't want to have is you saying you created it on one date and then the file creation date says something entirely different.
So a couple of quick points, Dave,
go ahead.
Before we move on. Just so everybody understands, the exaggeration word that it was used in that last slide is very important. Say what is so, not an exaggeration of what is so. Here's a way people typically get into the exaggeration mode, and it goes up to the first bullet. Don't describe individuals. I actually have had supervisors, managers, executives write things like, the one thing I can say about Bob is that he is a complete idiot. Here's the latest example. Number one, Bob's probably not a complete idiot. But number two, that shows bias on your part. And bias is going to get torn to shreds if you have to explain that to the EEOC, to a courtroom, to a judge. You do not want to have to do that. And one other thing that Dave also pointed out, slide before this, you don't have to go to it, is ascribing what others have said. Please, please, if someone told you, this is what Bob did, this is what I saw, and Mary is the person who told you, please make sure you say, Mary told me that she saw Bob do the following thing. Why? Because if you have to get on the stand and you don't say, well, Mary told me, then the assumption the court is justifiably going to make is that you're the one who saw it. And then they're going to ask you the intricate questions of the whys, the wherefores, the whens, the hows did you see this? And you're going to wind up with egg on your face. Mary said it, ascribe it to the person who told you. It's much better that way, cleaner and much safer for you. Okay?
Absolutely. So let's talk about some of the things you do want to do. Now, this is a model, almost like a checklist. If you use this method, this acronym, SAFE, situation, action, frequency, effect, you are going to include most of the necessary ingredients in good documentation. So situation, obviously, what was happening. Action, what did the employee do in the situation, i.e. what was happening. The frequency part you don't always need. Sometimes it's not applicable. Sometimes what you're doing is you're capturing a one-off incident or maybe the first of its kind. But it's good to have this in the acronym because if there is a trend developing in an employee's behavior or performance, good or bad, what you want to do is make sure that you call that out and say that this is a trend. This has happened several times before. And if you can cite specific dates and times and events that constitute that trend, it's going to make whatever you're arguing for, good or bad, a lot more effective. And then finally, very important, what was the effect? What was the result? What was the impact? Try to quantify as much as possible. It's not always the situation, but anytime you can use numbers or percentages and things along that line, it will strengthen it. Obviously, we have to qualify it a lot too, but just think about that and ask yourself, is there any quantifiable data I can put into this particular portion of this feedback, this documentation? So let's see a couple of examples and now walk through these now, okay? So I'll let you read through this situation real quick, and as I'm talking, you'll see on the left that there's the feedback model, the checklist that you're going to want to be looking for, and the portions that pertain to that checklist will highlight as we proceed through this example right here. So situation, what was happening? Right here, very simple, just a portion of the sentence. It doesn't have to be long. You don't have to write how the weather was that day or anything like that. Again, I cannot stress this enough. People feel this need. It maybe goes back to college or high school where you were told by your teacher you have to write a certain amount, that the quality of your assignment was first judged on whether or not it exceeded 8 pages or so many words. And yet in business, what does everybody crave? Clear, concise, impactful writing. So keep it short. Spell that experience in school of trying to write as much as you can. Now let's write concise. It's more effective. So we have our situation. Here's our action. What happened? There was a new work schedule created to cover personnel gaps. This maintained the operations, okay? Again, very simple. Frequency, in this instance, the employee, Emily, did not have other instances to look at in terms of this. It's not a trend, it's a one-time event. But the effect, this plan ensured no loss in productivity for 6 weeks. New staff could be hired, the gaps were filled, operations continued despite a problem. This is the kind of behavior and performance you want to laud as a company, as a manager, as a supervisor. And this is the way you capture it. Again, this is very, very short but effective. If you wrote this to yourself in an email, cite it later in the annual review, you've done yourself a huge favor, and you will show that you recognized and appreciated solutions like this from your staff. Let's look at another example. We have here the situation, date, year, and what's going on in particular. This winter production of these specialty widgets. This was an actual client situation that we dealt with. So we have that situation established, and then the action, a failure to follow safety protocols. Lever was manually forced until it broke, equipment now inoperable. Frequency, again, you don't have to do these in order. Sometimes the frequency is going to come later, sometimes earlier, but it's there. That's the key. Don't worry about it going necessarily in order as long as the ingredients are there, although obviously I would always recommend starting with situation. But in this case, a previous incident occurred where safety protocols were ignored, and that's important to bring up in this situation. Effect. Machine broke, money, productivity lost. This is what you want to be highlighting there. All right, again, this is really short and this is effective, and this will hold up in a court when you say, this is why this person was demoted, or this is why this person was fired.
By the way, courts look for what they call the so what. That's the effect we're talking about. He did something. And the court, if you just say he did something, is going to say, so what? Did it harm you as a business? Did it harm a person? Putting that in, and especially where it's equipment damage or things along that line, yes, it did hurt us. It cost us, in the case that you're listening to right now, in one case, and we're not exaggerating here, it did cost the company an estimated $250,000 to replace that particular and unusual piece of equipment. So the so what aspect really does count for something, especially when you're trying to show the impact of the action or inaction of the employee.
Right. And in this case, you'll see what's highlighted now, a bonus, corroboration. Who else witnessed it? What else can be looked upon, in this case, a security camera, to prove that the event occurred as you are documenting it? The only item I would add is, notice here, for the sake of brevity, I just put coworkers, but obviously you want to put their names in when you're doing something like this so you can cite them later. If you have it internally, that's fine. You need to know that. It doesn't necessarily need to be in the documentation, but it's always best to include that detail when possible. All right. All right, now let's look at what's wrong. And what wrong looks like, we're going to use a different acronym. We're going to use avoid. Angry, vague, overstatement, incomplete, delayed. All right. So obviously this first part of the sentence right here, angry. This is not an exaggeration. These are the kinds of things we see sometimes in documentation. What we've observed and asked for when we've asked for documentation to see what we get back. This kind of thing is not an exaggeration at all. I cannot stress how important it is never to do this, all right? Keep your writing factual, eliminate emotion. No matter how much you may be feeling it, eliminate it from this particular part of the process. Vague. You'll notice this same part's highlighted because it's vague. It doesn't really say what's happening. A terrible attitude, doesn't care about safety. Well, how? What specifically hasn't happened? What specifically wasn't done? How was safety not taken into account? Make sure those types of details are captured so you can say not just a editorialized appraisal of what happened, but specifically what happened. Answer those key questions: who, what, when, where, what effect. Overstated. This is another one that's key. Always, never. I know it's kind of an oxymoron, but never say never. You don't want to do that kind of language within any sort of documentation. It really causes problems. And this is the kind of thing that a defense attorney can absolutely pick apart and now paint you in the light of being biased and against that employee, as opposed to trying to objectively capture what happened. Incomplete. So I've already said a lot of things that are missing here in terms of date, time, location, witnesses, what specifically happened. All of these things are missing from this example. We don't have them. You need them. Delayed. Don't wait. All right. The always and never in this line has kind of 2 points to it. Number one, it's an overstatement. And number two, it suggests that this sort of problem has happened before and wasn't documented. The key with that is you've allowed it. And even if your policy says we do not allow X type of behavior, whatever that may be, if you allow it enough times in the past, guess what? The precedence now becomes the policy. That employee, if they are fired and get an attorney, can now come back and say, yeah, but other people are allowed to do it, or I was allowed to do it in the past. It undermines your policy. It undermines your documentation. Precedence can trump policy if it is allowed to. Don't allow it to. This is key, and this is not as much a criticism of the documentation process, but it's a common error we see. We really want to dissuade people away from that. So documentation, it saves time. It reduces risk. You could argue it saves money. I'd say most of the instances where we have a problem and encounter good documentation, you better believe it is saving you money and protecting your company's bottom line, because you now don't have to worry about the threat of litigation and financial loss, and more importantly, time and productivity loss on dealing with these issues. The more you have documented, the shorter the problem is going to last. That's key. It makes your job easier. If you have these types of things documented, good employee, bad employee, good performance, bad performance, if you captured it effectively, you can reward or punish accordingly without having to do a lot of follow-on work in the form of defending your decision, because the documentation speaks for itself. Finally, it protects your employees. It's not something that should be viewed as a punitive measure against your employees. On the contrary, this is the tool you use to reward the good ones, the ones you want to see rise within the ranks. This justifies your promotion decisions. It expresses to them that you care. And when done properly, it also shows them how to do it for the generation of employees they're eventually going to lead. You want to set those habits and behaviors early on. This is a fantastic way to do it. This is why we say it is important to document, and we hope that this has been educational. Questions and discussion, we can open up now when you're ready.
All right, David, thank you. So one of the questions we have here, we talked a lot about, sending yourself emails and writing things down as quick as possible. Would you recommend just, putting all the details down, or maybe having a set type of a form so that there are things that aren't missed?
I would say, number one, the most important thing is to document, period. You may not be in a place where you can, just easily run back and get the standard form. A standard form is fine. In fact, it is desirable. But the first thing you've got to do, maybe you're only going to be able to write it on a Post-it note, who knows? But you can always transcribe that onto the form later if you have to. But the most important thing is getting it right. Getting the information that needs to be documented, not opinions, not editorialisms, facts and information down. Then transcribe it later if you need to. If your business does have a standard form, that's very good. But if you don't, we can help you come up with one. Not very hard, doesn't take a lot of time, but document, document, document. You know, the 3 C's of leadership: consistency, communication, and caring. Yes. And the 3 D's of leadership are document, document, document. I'm dead serious about that.
Of course. All right. Well, thank you for that. I don't see any other questions that have come in. So I think you guys have hit on all the points everybody needed answered today.
Well, I'll tell you what I want to do. I want to leave one more thing for you.
Yes.
The 10-90-0 rule. Have you ever heard of the 10-90-0 rule?
I don't think that I have.
No, that's because I made it up. But it works every time. The 10-90-0 tool, if you will, actually talks to performance. And it talks to the one thing that every single person in every single business is hired to do, one way or another: solve problems. Something needs to get done and nobody else can do it, so you'll do it. Or you'll see an issue and you will try to resolve it. But the ratio that a lot of people need to understand is the 10-90-0 rule. This is not science, this is just to illustrate. You get approximately 10% of your pay for identifying problems. There is real value in identifying problems, obviously. But there are those people who think, once I pointed it out, my job is done. No. Once you identify a problem, your job begins. And either you, or with others, or to the expert you need to go to, they, with your help and information, can help solve the problem. That's what you get the other 90% of your pay for. 10% for identifying a problem, 90% for solving the problem. Always remember that ratio. And remember, 0, that's what you get paid for causing problems. And I will tell you, most supervisors, and I can say this with 40 years of experience, the single thing that I have seen in 40 years that supervisors and leaders and even executives do least well is document. It will save you time, it will save you anguish, it may save you an awful lot of money. But one way or the other, solve the problem, don't let it go on, and don't assume it'll go away. The 5 deadliest words for a supervisor are maybe it will go away. They don't.
Nope.
So that's the last thing I wanted to lead with. Dave, anything for you?
One last thing. If you are out there in audience land and you are saying to yourself, oh man, I have not documented properly and I've got a bad situation, that doesn't mean you're sunk. It doesn't mean you're defeated. It means you need help. I would seek it quickly in terms of the form of, an HR expert, consultancy, something like that. It's going to be a tougher road, but it can be done. But the sooner the problem is dealt with, whatever that may be, the better off you're going to be. I think the other axiom that we encounter a lot among clients, it's not something they say, but it certainly captures their behavior, is maybe that'll just go away. Maybe the problem that I'm dealing with will just go away. If I just ignore it long enough, it'll fade. That's a really bad gamble. And if you are sitting there right now and looking at these examples of what documentation should be, dealing with a problem that required documentation earlier than you did or at all, it's not too late, but address this sooner than later. Don't let the problem dictate when you're going to deal with it. It'll always be to the problem.
Good takeaways, guys. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. And for all the attendees, this was recorded, so it is going to be sent out to you, so you can refer back to that. Of course, you've got the emails there of Gary and David. I'm sure they'd be happy to talk through some more things if you have any questions.
Absolutely.
Of course, the next step after documentation is storage, and higher level we have our HRIS platform, which makes it very, very easy to store all of these documents through each employee file and keep a good record that you can refer back to after you've made great and clear documentation. Coming up on the docket for higher level high notes, next month, I want to invite you to join myself and Whitney Morris as we talk about interviewing, maybe talk about some of those questions that you're not sure, should I ask this, should I not, how do I find out the information I want to know, and maybe is this legal? So we're going to hit on all of those questions and hope you'll be joining us on August 28th for that. And we will let you go for the day. Thank you all for joining.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Summer?